I would really like to introduce Peter Symes to talk about the development of the living collection strategy for the Melbourne Botanic Gardens. Peter is the Senior Curator of Horticulture at the Melbourne Gardens, has been there for a long time. Peter is something of the engine room at the RBG Melbourne Horticulture, an extraordinary influential individual in the Botanic Garden network. Pete has been the conduit to developing the living collections plan for the Melbourne Gardens. That's our main presentation. After the presentation, there'll be opportunities for a few questions. So if I could throw to Pete, and Pete, if you could share your screen, that'd be terrific.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much. Share, and hopefully everyone can hear me. That's working.
Yep, good, Pete. All good.
I don't know how I'll get rid of all these people on the side here. Maybe I just go to, that's better. Now I can actually see what I'm talking about. So thanks everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to present this. I'm really only giving you an overview. There's a lot more to this strategy and what I'm actually providing, but just some key elements. One of the things I will say first up is this is not your typical collections policy. So it actually is the document's a combination of a strategy, collections policy, but also decision support and guidelines. So it's got more detail than what you might typically see as a strategy. And I also want to acknowledge there's been quite a lot of input into this from our engagement team, from science, but also very importantly, our horticultural team have also been involved. So it's not just my work, it's a composite of work. Thought it might be good to remind ourselves what a living plant collection actually is. And we all sort of take this for granted, but in its very sort of basic form, it's a group of plants grown for a distinct purpose or purposes. And then we have, I suppose, a series of attributes or criteria that we would describe as a collection, whether it's for conservation or display, education, learning and interpretation or research. And some might also add recreation to this as well. But this is pretty typical for collections around the world. Most botanic gardens would recognise this sort of language, and the images you see here are, I suppose, snapshots of the collections we have and the themes with those collections, which I'm coming to. So within our living collection strategy, these are the themes that we're working with. And on the left-hand side, you'll see that the theme, on the right-hand side, you'll see examples of the collections that apply to that theme. And here again, fairly typical for a lot of botanic gardens to have this sort of thematics for their collections. I'd like to talk about some of them a little bit more. So geographical, seems fairly obvious, defined geographical area, and often they're defined around countries of origin. But as we know, plants are distributed often beyond political boundaries. So you might look at geographical as being biogeographical in the sense that your collection may extend across countries. So for example, North American drylands as a collection that we're developing actually extends into Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and the USA. So it's not confined to the USA, and that's technically the North American continent. So you can get away with that. The other aspect of that is that you might look at plants that are defined by sharing a similar climate within a geographic area, and I'll come to that later. Ecological, people who are very familiar with ecological vegetation classes will grasp this pretty quickly. So it could be, usually it's a very specific vegetation type and a particular habitat that you would apply that. In our case, it's the lower Yarra River habitat, and Therese, who's listening, will be overjoyed because that's an area that she's got a lot of expertise in. But essentially the flora of Melbourne's Yarra River at the lower end, that's what that collection tries to do. And the last one I wanted to talk a bit about was taxonomic and evolutionary. Typically it's genus-based or plant group-based that we might want to demonstrate evolution. But it can also refer to collections that have, say, co-evolution or developed adaptations that are similar because of the, I suppose, prevailing environment in which they've developed in. So the cacti and succulent collection loosely can include other plants. So you might have aloes, agaves, cactaceae, but also bromeliads, because one of the adaptations they share is a special type of photosynthesis called CAM photosynthesis. So they've all evolved this to cope with dry conditions. Then you have research and conservation. We're all quite familiar with these sorts of themes. Ornamental and cultural, which is quite a heavy emphasis in these gardens. In terms of our living collection strategy direction, we are working a lot harder on the geographical themes, which will become apparent. So why do we need a living collection strategy rather than a collection policy? I think one of the things we do have to keep in mind is that botanic gardens are actually social ecological constructs or social ecological landscapes. They're actually a composite of art, culture, the environment, science, and people. And they're complex landscapes. We manage them over very long time scales. So it's really important that we integrate our planning with other plans that we have in place and have a very integrated approach to it. The other aspect that we looked at is how do we improve our connection to the international stage and context. A lot of you will be familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, and we've actually looked at aspects of our operation. Where do we connect to in the Sustainable Development Goals globally? And other aspects which you'll be more familiar with, like the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation, coming out of the Convention on Biological Diversity. We face really substantial challenges in our collections at Melbourne Gardens with climate change. Over 25% of our taxa are considered to be at very high risk. So we had to respond to that challenge. And here's a chart of the trends for Melbourne. You can see temperature going up, essentially, and rainfall going down. I won't go into a lot of detail, but you can see the widening gap. So we have to be able to manage our collection sustainably. And really wanted to get a very strong focus on how do we engage with our visitors and influence human behaviour. How do we make the collections really speak to the community that visits the gardens? That was a strong focus for us. And for the first time, creating some actual measurable targets. A lot of collections policies don't actually have targets in them or aims. And so we wanted to create targets which we could measure ourselves against and also evaluate the collections, which has never been actually done before, I suppose, formally in the gardens. In terms of context, you'll be familiar with the Flora and Fauna Guarantee, which is a key piece of Victorian legislation for our threatened plants and threatening processes. That's sort of a given. Also looking at, in our state, climate change, hence because of the threats to our collections from climate change. And also the sort of flagship biodiversity plan for Victoria, Biodiversity 2037. And the reason I put up that particular strategy or plan, if you like, is that when you read through it, it's very interesting. These are sort of the vision and goals of this plan about Victoria's biodiversity being healthy and cared for, but it refers to contexts that are broader than just Victorian's flora. And in this plan, RBG Victoria gets quite a lot of mentions. It refers to recognising traditional custodians, climate change science, research monitoring, weed risk, international conferences, but also importantly, the role that our collections play in providing wellbeing and health benefits for our visitors. So really strongly connected to biodiversity planning. And also I wanted to share with you the landscape planning framework in which the collection sort of sits. So I mentioned earlier about being integrated with other plans. a number of you will be familiar with our landscape succession strategy. And essentially this planning framework is not a hierarchical system. It's more about information flow. So the green is essentially where there's a very strong relationship in flow of information. And these all speak to each other. And we're essentially trying to improve the integration or the line of sight, if you like, between plans. What are the connecting pieces that, so things aren't done in isolation. So the benefits of living collection strategy, really wanted to position the living collections as really the heart of the organisation's profile. It really is what makes a botanic garden, and really give this a lot of attention. Really wanted to focus on professional development, because the success of your collection is really linked to the skills of those that look after it, and I'll come back to that in more detail. The other consideration was providing a source of corporate knowledge. As an organisation, we've gone through enormous change over the last few years with restructuring and new people, and there's a risk that information gets lost, or people don't know where to go to find a basis of information. So it was really important to capture a range of knowledge in this plan, and some would argue that possibly our strategy is a bit too detailed, but it's actually what we needed now. Also, you know, a really sound basis to engage supporters and seek funds. With the landscape succession strategy, we're already attracting donor attention, and we've already had funding to support some of the aims in that project. So quite important. And I'll come back to some of these other aspects further on. The other interesting finding was in developing the strategy was we actually started to look at things we could improve now, and already in the living collections database there's been improvement driven by the development of the strategy. So there's where you can actually improve things. Just an overview of the 4 main strategies within the living collection strategy. And these connect to 4 targets and about 40 actions. And I'm of course not going to go through every single one of them here today. But essentially that's the 4 cores of the gardens. And of course Renee's listening. I'm going to pick on her a little bit here. Picture of Renee there. And she's actually got ginger and turmeric growing in the herb and medicinal garden. So some of the techniques that are being developed are how do we cultivate new crops in our, I suppose, more display collections. And that's, you know, feeding into the excellence in which we curate. I wanted to just really delve a bit into professional development, because I think this is a really key one for living collections. And there's been numerous botanical authors really highlighting how important horticulturists and curators are for botanical or conservation horticulture. And really you can measure the success and quality of the living collections right back to the people who are curating and managing those collections. So why wouldn't you invest in the people who look after these collections? Very, very important. And there's a range of images here. I'll talk a bit about some of them. So some of you will even be in this shot of the BGANZ workshop. It's fantastic where BGANZ actually involves apprentices and horticulturists at these sorts of events, and I would encourage more of that. There's a shot of Gemma here down on the left, collecting in northeast New South Wales, and I want to really thank the Botanic Gardens and Domain Trust. They've been fantastic collaborators with our new collection direction, and really makes a huge difference. Botanic Gardens can't afford to be competitive. We've got to become a lot more collaborative. So I'm really grateful for that. Joe in California here, learning about propagation. And this shot down the bottom I want to highlight, because this is our horticultural team meeting delegates during the Climate Change Alliance that we held in Melbourne. And we've got people there from Israel, from China, and from the USA. And I actually think that engagement with our horticulturists actually helped make the Climate Change Summit and all the work that's happened since then a much stronger success. People out, Dave here, out on top of a probably 1,000-year-old Eucalyptus glaucescens, and here's Kate out in New Zealand at the front of a glacier. So this is the investment that's going on in our horticulturalists and curators. Learning interpretation. I wanted to look at this one. We often talk about this and often have this in our botanic gardens and say that we do this. Often I think it doesn't do the job very well. And one of the dangers that botanic gardens fall into is measuring their activities rather than the impact they're actually having. An example of that is, we had 2 million visitors last year. Well, that's great, but what impact did we have on those 2 million visitors? Or we run a whole lot of programs in the gardens, had this attendance, but what difference have we made? So what the question is, what is a true test of our effectiveness as a botanic garden? And I would argue that our effectiveness is whether we've been able to influence human behaviour and enable people to make better decisions about protecting plants and biodiversity, both at the individual level and in society. We'll be having lots of these conversations in the gardens here. The other approach to learning interpretation is not so much focusing on plant conservation, no matter how important that is. And a great example of where it engages with people is the Care for the Rare program that's happening in Victoria. But there's other ways that we can deliver interpretation. So we're looking at the climate change message. It's a way of connecting people to the importance of plants in our world. But also plant-based solutions is another way that we can interpret using the collections. Pollution treatment, reducing runoff and flood control, environmental cooling. I mean, a small to medium-sized tree has basically got the cooling power of 2 residential air conditioners. These are the sort of messages that really can connect people to the importance of protecting plants and appreciating them. In terms of the way the collections are managed, we've basically created a living collections reference group. That group comprises a representative from science, or a botanist if you like, but also our engagement team, the management level, the curator and the landscape architect. So this performs a reference group in looking at the way overall that our collections are managed and how we evaluate them. And so I've just shown you an example of the criteria here on which we're going to approach evaluating our collections. And it looks a bit confronting and a bit frightening, I guess, for some. And one of the things I emphasise, it's not so much about identifying collections that perform not as well as we would like, and maybe even consider a de-accessioning or stopping that collection development, but it may be more about looking at what areas we need to improve. So it becomes a way of examining the weaknesses, if you like, and how do we actually shift those forward. Now, is the collection still relevant to current botanical and societal issues? Does it sitting within the RBG's mission? What do we have the resources to continue to sustain that collection? Does it sit within the climate? These are all sort of considerations, and it gives us a point in time in which to stop and measure. And really it's fitting into your typical adaptive management cycle where we're setting targets, we're implementing those, we're looking at the evaluation side of things, and then adjusting and moving on from there. In terms of where the living collection strategy looks like for management plans, we basically create a 5-year plan, and we have these management plans in place already. We do have to actually work through these and review them, and we're sort of in the middle of that. But this is an example of the sort of template, if you like, for the front page of a living collection management plan. It's a 5-year plan, and from that, we feed that into an annual plan. And if you like it, you could see it as a bit of a shopping list. I don't want to sort of demean it because it's actually quite important, but that's essentially the action plan that the curator of a given collection works to. It's been interesting with COVID-19. I'm basically getting run off my feet with horticulturists working on these from home, delivering a whole lot of things. So it really makes it very much a targeted focus to pushing the collection forward. But we have challenges still, and we've got really substantial challenges in increasing our plant diversity from where we are, and also particularly with a focus on climate change, but also trying to improve the proportion of wild provenance source plants, because there's just so many values to doing that. But the challenges, that is a challenging target on its own, but we're also facing challenges around the Convention on Biological Diversity. Some of you will be familiar with the Nagoya Protocol and aspects like that. But essentially, to obtain plant material from overseas, there's a whole lot of layers you have to navigate to enable that. And elements like BICON, Australian Biosecurity Import Conditions Database. If plants aren't on a permitted species list, it can be very difficult to access that material into the country. So they're two weighty challenges. You can add weed risk assessments to that as well. But essentially, we're looking at a platform where we're looking at our, I suppose, national opportunities in Australia. And, we've been working closely with the Botanic Gardens of Adelaide and Royal Botanic Gardens and Domain Trust in Sydney. There's been some great conversations going on there about sharing collection material and looking at ways how we work together. And that's Therese there on a collecting trip in far north tropical mountains of Queensland. And this is the that picture down there on your far right is the climate change summit that we had here in Melbourne. And you'll notice a couple of our horticulturists are actually involved here in discussions with directors and senior managers and people from around the world. So really important to have that international context. And we're working with a number of these people in terms of accessing plant material.
Couple minutes, Pete.
Hey, how much? 5 minutes?
No, 2.
2 minutes. I better speed up. So for the first time that I can recall, we have in our annual business plan, we actually have a target to increase climate-suited taxa comprising a majority of wild provenance. So this is actually in our next 12-month plan, and it's a little bit frightening because it's quite challenging. I want to talk about some of the opportunities. This is a map showing, I suppose, an intersect of a temperature range and rainfall. So looking at 17 to 21 degrees and 200 to 1100 millimetres. And we're looking at geographic regions around the world. And you can sort of pull those out as a bit of a focus point. And these are some of the plant species that we're potentially looking at in terms of focusing on areas for developing the geographic collections. I'm almost done, John. One of the things that really came out of this process was there's real opportunities to support others in their development of collection policy. Basically conducted a worldwide literature review at the time, and there was quite strategic gaps in policies and plans. We didn't actually find any strategy that really fitted our needs, so we had to develop our own. And during this process, I've had numerous requests for people wanting copies of it, which suggests there is an appetite for this sort of document. And we believe we can support others by adding this to a portfolio of world-leading publications like the Landscape Succession Strategy. We've got some strengths. We want to build on these. So we actually these sort of results actually surprised me when Paul Smith from BGCI reported on this. I was a little bit shocked where we sat. And we want to sort of continue that position, particularly with the diversity. But almost at the end, John, but surprisingly, when we did a bit of analysis, we found that with all the taxa that we're growing, we're basically globally representing most of the countries of the world. And that was, some of this is really good messaging for us. But I say to you who are listening, finding some messages about your collections, your garden, in which you can position yourself. This sort of thing does get donor attention and support attention. Thank you very much.
Terrific, Peter. It's we would all do the virtual clap thing, I'm sure. Look, we've got a couple of minutes for questions, or a minute for question. There is a question here from, it looks like Phil Parsons. Yep. Phil's as I'm sure we all are liking and indeed loving the idea of collaboration. Phil's pointed out that Tassie has a cooler climate, so what about sending threatened plants threatened by warmth to the Tasmanian gardens through partnership arrangements? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, open to that idea. We've had yeah, there's certainly potential for that, particularly species that may have rare and threatened status or been wild collected. So certainly open to that idea of the meta collection where material is grown across a number of gardens. So yeah, the answer is yes, we'll definitely be considering that sort of thing.
Okay, fantastic. And just a quick one here, which was what are the key targets that you're focusing on just at the present, top shelf aims?
Sorry, key targets?
Key targets you're focusing on just now, right in the present.
Key targets really are trying to establish networks by which we can obtain more plant material to meet those diversity targets and more climate resilient material. So that really is our target at the moment, really sort of developing that area. Okay,
great. And just please clarify what ID3 is, Peter.
Sorry, that's jargon. So ID3 means it's been formally identified by a botanist at the gardens. So it's not just what we think it is, it's actually been taken through a process. So it is what it's meant to be rather than just a guess.
Fantastic. And there's a comment that people can read about, did the Melbourne Gardens steal Melton Botanic Gardens Geographic Collections Plan?
I don't think so. This was done very independently for our own climate analysis here. So
parallel evolution or parallel
I think
thinking?
It could be. I haven't actually seen the Geographic Collections Plan in Melton Gardens, so
maybe John could send that through.
Yeah, look, happy to talk to John about that. I'm sure we've got lots that we can share and collaborate on.
Fantastic, Peter. That was great, on time, on message, on point. Thank you very much for the contribution. If people do have any subsequent questions, I'm sure Peter would be up to an email exchange at some point into the future. But thanks, Peter.
Yeah, welcome.
A cracking presentation once again. Cheers.
Thank you.
Clap, clap, clap.